I am grieving the loss of my grandmother. She died over 20 years ago, and I'm only beginning to grieve her now because I'm grieving who I'm realizing she was and understanding that she was, if it's possible, a zillion times more evil than my mother. My mother is a sociopath and a narcissist. I've been no contact with her for over 30 years. Every memory I have attached to my mother is laced with my fear of her and with me trying to earn her love. There was never a moment where I felt like my mother liked me, let alone loved me. There's never a moment where I was able to trust her. And that includes in the memories I don't have. And the reason that I know that is because there was a babysitter who's known me since the day I was born. And that babysitter was 10 years old when I was born. She has told me stories of going to my house every day after school to check on me with her mother because my mother wasn't changing my diapers, she wasn't feeding me. Sometimes she would just take off for the weekend and leave no food, no nothing behind. And so, in a nutshell, she was completely neglecting me. From the time that I was born, it's pretty evident that my mother hated me. And the knowledge of that, as horrible as it was, pales into comparison to who my grandmother has turned out to be. I've had memories of my grandmother my whole life, and those memories used to be filled with love, and she hung the moon, and she was the most amazing person to me ever. And now, as I'm so far removed from all of those relationships, and of course, she died 20 years ago, and I wasn't in a relationship with her at the time, I'm realizing what an absolute evil, horrible, devastating person she was to my life, and how she actually made my mother hate me more, if that was even possible, than she already did. I lived with my grandparents when I was around 5 years old until I was 9. And then even after that, I spent a lot of time at their house, a lot of weekends at their house. My grandmother was my safe space. And again, I cannot tell you how much I loved her. From the time that I was tiny, 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 she was grooming me. My grandmother groomed me. My grandmother weaponized me. I was just a little girl. And she is actually at the foundation of some of the things that almost destroyed my life completely. I'm going to tell you a few stories that I used to remember with incredible fondness, and even some that I kind of laughed at that I didn't understand the significance of. My grandmother was an alcoholic, and I didn't realize that growing up. In fact, it would be years before I would realize that. My grandmother would have drinks that were not quite completely gone, with ice barely melted actually in them, hidden in all these spots all over the house. In their first house where they lived in Montreal, and then the house or the condo that they owned in Miami that they eventually moved into. And I used to find them all the time, from the time that I was really little until I would say I was 11 or 12 years old. And they'd be underneath the sink. There'd be a drink like in her bathroom. She had her own bathroom, or drinks under the kitchen sink. Going into the den, there would be this big bookcase with pictures, frames and things like that in it. And there'd be drinks behind those. And basically anywhere that she could go in the house, anywhere she would visit, any room she would stop by, I guess she was taking a little sip here and there and everywhere. And I never really thought much of it until I became an adult. And of course, as I became an adult, it made sense in what else was happening along the way. And by the way, this isn't what makes her evil. This is not that. But I want to share the story so that you can get to know the grandmother that I thought I knew. My aunts, my grandmother had three daughters. My mother was the oldest, and then there were two younger daughters. Would come like to dinner or something like that, whether it was at the house in Montreal or Miami, didn't matter where it was. And I would be, just hanging out, being my little kid self. And I would hear at least one of my aunts, "You're slurring your words, how much if you had to drink," kind of thing, really angrily. And I would hear my grandfather, without missing a beat, "Baloney, she's fine, baloney." Baloney was his favorite word. I don't eat baloney. Probably for that damn reason, except for one restaurant in Montreal, which never mind about that. It's a long story. It's not a long story. It's just a really famous one. Anyway, my grandfather would stop the whole thing, and the night would go on, and that would be pretty much the end of the conversation, beginning, end, and middle. And I never really thought about it until I became an adult, and I realized, oh, my grandmother was an alcoholic. I also have really fond memories. It happened more than once, attached to my grandmother and her drinking. Once a month when we lived in Montreal, her and my Aunt Helen, and I use quotation marks because of the fact that she wasn't related by DNA, who owned grocery stores in Montreal, would pick my grandmother up, or my grandmother would pick her up, whatever the case may be, because the floors in the house were being waxed and we couldn't be there all day. So these two ladies, my grandmother and my Aunt Helen, would take this little girl, it was like 6, 7 years old, out for Girls' Day. Best day ever. We would go to this department store, and I'm naming names for the people who live in Montreal and Miami and wherever else like that can relate to this. We would go to Ogilvy's and we would have a ladies' lunch, which basically meant Shirley Temples for me. And such a fun, like I remember the details. I would have chicken in a basket with honey and French fries, and they would maybe buy some outfits, and me included, and then we would go to the grocery store that was owned by my Aunt Helen, and I would get to ride in the cart, and they'd put the groceries on me. And by the way, I'm a kid who doesn't have a lot of childhood good stuff going on. I'm a kid whose mother tried to unalive her by dropping her out of a 2-story window, who was gone for a lot of the times. And thankfully, now that I know, it was good that she was gone, but it was also bad that she was gone, because my grandmother was literally the devil, like wolf in sheep's clothing. Anyway, we would go to the grocery store and do that whole thing, the groceries on top of me, and I would just be ever so happy. And then they would spend an inordinate amount of time looking for whichever vehicle they came in, because they were shattered, they were drunk. And then we would get back to my grandmother's house, and Lucien, who was the guy who waxed the floors, would be like tapping his foot, sitting here like this, waiting to be paid. So I imagine that every month they weren't just like 10 or 15 minutes late. I think they were late. And if it was winter, it was worse, because if it snowed, finding the car in a drunk state. And I mean, we're talking about a parking lot. We're not talking about like 10 floors of a garage, right? Anyway, I love those memories. And, well, I hate every memory attached to my grandmother right now. I can't say I love them anymore. And I'm hating that she's stolen that from me. And I want to process this with you as I'm going through it, because I talk a lot about how healing is a lifelong journey, and this is what I mean by that. This isn't going to sidetrack my life, but it's definitely triggering my days and my nights. I'm not sleeping well, and I am struggling a bit. And I will get through it. I'll get through the loss and the anger and all of the emotions that come with that. But in the meantime, this is my way, I guess, of burying my grandmother and recognizing the evil that she was. So the evil that my grandmother was is built around the grooming and the fake love. she used to treat me like I was this beautiful, sweet little girl. Like she would tell me that I was so cute and beautiful and hug me and kiss me. And I remember her perfume, which makes me want to vomit right now, but Belle de Versailles. And I remember how beautifully coiffed she always was, and her perfume bottles, and I used to admire them. And I just used to have all these amazing memories around this woman that I idolized. Like she was the hostess with the mostest. She used to throw these afternoon teas or canasta parties. I think it was called canasta. It's a card game or something. These lunches for the ladies who would come over, and mahjong and all of these different things, social activities. And she was very fashionable. And I just wanted to be just like her. I just thought she was amazing. And now I know that she wasn't. So what's the punchline? I'm going to share the story. I'm building up to it. But I want to tell you a few things that happened along the way that I'm recognizing my grandmother did to me. She made my mother hate me more. I didn't think that was possible, but she did. When we moved to Miami and I would spend time at my grandmother used to make these belts out of like silk rope with flowers and beads, and you could wear it as a belt or you could wear it around your neck and sell them to Saks and Neiman Marcus at Bal Harbour. And I would have been probably around 9 years old, and I would go over to my grandmother's quite a bit, and she would tell my mother that she needed me to help her and all this and that. And I would macrame the belts and help her, and she would pay me a little bit even. And then she would brag to my mother how talented I was, how beautiful I was, how great I was, how smart, how funny. She would tell my mother little stories. And I remember the look on my mother's face. And if I remember it as a child, I know my grandmother saw it. And I have no doubt in my mind that my grandmother recognized that when I would then go home with my mother, my life would be exponentially worse, that my mother would be angrier, that she would be more abusive. And I know my grandmother knew it, because it's no coincidence that there were a lot of those times where I would run away right after being at my grandparents' house. I now recognize I was also running away from my grandfather, but more in the moment from my grandmother. And again, I'll get there in a minute. My mother used to do the same thing with my little girl towards me. The difference is I loved my daughter right from, well, before she came out, before she was born. But my mother would try to show me that she could love my daughter, not me. Just like my grandmother was showing me that she could love me and showing my mother that she could love me, not her. And the difference ended up being that I went no contact with my mother over it, because I saw my mother pitting my two children. I had a little boy at the time too. I mean, I have a son now, but I could see her pitting my children against each other, like creating division between them. I didn't understand what it meant. I didn't understand what it was. I was in my very early 20s at the time, but I did understand that my children deserved to be treated with love and kindness and equally. And so I went no contact to protect them. I didn't go no contact because of how my mother was treating me, because I believed the way she treated me, even at that time in my early 20s, was my fault. So my mother learned this little game clearly from my grandmother. So this little game of weaponizing me, her granddaughter, against my mother is not the reason. Well, it is on the list of what makes my grandmother evil. It's not at the top of the list. There were some other things along there too, like the recognition of what a liar and gaslighter she was. Looking backwards, and I would ask her questions like, I had a memory around my mother having bandages around her wrists. So evidently my mother tried to unalive herself at some point in time. And yes, I do feel compassion about that. But at the same time, my mother's a sociopath and a narcissist. I also have no feelings around it. I asked my grandmother about it, and I was probably 10, 11, somewhere in there. I don't know. It would be anywhere between the ages of 9 and 12 because that's when I still had a relationship with my grandmother inside of the Miami condo. So that's how I can track it. And my grandmother looked at me without missing a beat. That never happened. And I'm like, but I remember, I pushed back a little bit, and she's like, no, you're imagining things. Now, I'm the family liar since I'm 4 years old. I remember hearing that. I remember hearing that I had a huge imagination, that I was always making up stories. So when my grandmother said that to me, I knew I wasn't lying, but I didn't know that I didn't imagine it. Turns out I didn't imagine it because years later, my biological father, without knowing that I had that memory, told me a story of what my mother had done around that time. So that's not lie one, but that's one that I've always remembered. Another really big one, like a really big, easy to find out lie, unlike the other one, was when I ran away from home. So I ran away from home somewhere around 1979, 1980. And I was sent back home by social services in August of 1983. My grandmother told me, and also told my eldest daughter when my eldest daughter was an adult, that she had worked tirelessly trying to find me, and that the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and Mr. Walsh had been such a great help and comfort to the family, and like really elaborate stuff that she was telling, like that she was like look at us and look what we did, and we were so important, and your mother's picture was everywhere, and this, that, and the other. Probably should have fact checked, because the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children didn't exist the entire time that I was a runaway. Not even for 1 second or 1 day. That came after. But again, that's not why I am recognizing my grandmother as being the most evil woman on earth. It's just those things feed into the entire picture. And those memories are the ones that have really clicked this final massive memory into place, into the place that it belongs, into the reality of what my situation was with reference to my grandparents. So my grandfather, he molested me. I'm trying to be careful because I know that sometimes when we put language out there on different platforms, we get zapped for it, and it gets, we get strikes and all these things, which is so sad that we can't have open dialogue on any platform about CSA. It's so important. Anyway, my grandfather had been doing things to me since I was a really little girl. And as a young adult and a mom, I went no contact with him, which is when my entire family called to attack me and tell me what a horrible person I was, that I wasn't allowing him to have access to my eldest daughter. That was my only daughter at the time. I have 2 daughters, but my youngest wasn't born yet. Not my son. They never made mention of him, by the way, because my grandfather preferred girls. And guess what? My grandmother used to refer to my mother as being his favorite, and then she referred to me as being his favorite. So when I went no contact with my grandfather, and I agonized around what that looked like and what the loss of my grandmother was going to be for me, and I was devastated, because it was easy to cut him off. I wanted him gone. I wanted him dead. In fact, when he died, I felt relief. And as much as I felt those things, I equally felt devastation around the loss of my grandmother. And I wanted to keep her in my life, and I realized that I couldn't. Because a memory that I had normalized wasn't telling me the truth. And this is why I am grieving the loss of my grandmother. And I should say, not a memory I had normalized, a memory that was an action that was normalized by my grandparents. This is a massive trigger warning, and I'm going to edit this on some platforms, but not on this platform. So if you want to see this entire video, not chopped into pieces, this is where you can see it. When I lived with my grandparents, after my mother broke my arms, when she tried to unalive me, when she dropped me out of the 2-story window. And so just for a little, visual, my arms were broken in such a way, in 3 places actually, where I was straight casted, and the cast went around my thumb and all the way up until my underarms. So this was me. I literally do not have one memory of my arms in casts. I remember the day they were put on, like having them for like a millisecond. And I definitely remember when they removed them, because I was terrified when that saw came up my way. That's it. I don't have any memory in between there. And I was living with my grandparents, and I recognize why, because where the memories do start after my arms were no longer in casts were of the way that my grandmother lured me in for my grandfather. My grandmother would invite me into the bedroom to have a good night cuddle. She used to call them love ups. And her and my grandfather would be in bed with nothing on. And my grandmother would tell me to have nothing on. I'm trying to be careful how I word this. And she would invite me into the bed, and she would give me a love up. She would cuddle me. And I would look forward to that. I was like 6 years old, starving for affection. And I remember nuzzling into her and her telling me such good things about myself, and playing with my hair, and the scent of that fucking Belle de Versailles perfume, which makes me want to gag now. I don't even know if it still exists, and nothing against the company. This is now a memory for me that is forever in context and destroyed in terms of who I know my grandmother actually was. And in some ways, like as I think about it, I feel really sorry for my mother. Never going to justify what she did to me or who she is. It's never going to make anything okay, but I feel sorry for her, because she was with them her whole life until she escaped. And I recognize that. She also made choices of putting me in a living hell as well. And when I had my own children, I made the choice not to. So there is no license here. It's just, I feel sorry for her, like I would, I guess, well, I know, as I would for any child going through what my grandparents put me through. So my grandmother would invite me in for this love up. Sometimes we would sing little songs, and she would hold me and hug me and kiss me, and like very affectionate. If anybody looking in, but for the fact that there were no clothes involved, would look at this little grandmother loving on her little granddaughter. And then she would turn over and go to sleep and leave me to my grandfather. She leveraged the love that I needed to destroy me, and destroyed any good memory I've ever had about her and that part of my childhood as I once knew it. I don't even have any more words around that right now. The reason that I started having these memories is completely unknown to me. I guess my brain has been protecting me from grieving the last family member. And I recognized that my grandmother lured me in about 2 years ago, but it wasn't until recently that it's really like all the pieces have really fallen into place for me. And I knew something was brewing because I've just been so next level triggered lately. Like I've wanted to shop out of control. Fortunately, I don't do that to myself anymore. I manage that now, but the desire has been really overwhelming. And in the past, I've done it to the point of not being able to pay my rent, like really bad stuff. I've been eating like completely out of whack for me, binging, not eating, like it's been an absolute nightmare. Sleep and my sleep patterns have been off the charts messed up. The shortness of breath has been every single night. And so as I'm triggered and I'm processing all that's going on, I thought that I would share it because we heal together. And because people need to understand that when somebody hurts a child in this way, I'm 58 years old, we carry it somewhere with us for the whole rest of our lives. And no matter how good our life gets, and mine is pretty damn good, I'm healthy, I'm happy, other than what I'm going through right now. My kids are healthy and happy. My grandkids are healthy and happy. I'm in Spain. I'm traveling. I love, love, love my job. I'm a therapist for adult survivors of narcissistic family systems. Like my whole life has fallen into place, other than I don't have a significant other, but I'm working on it. But I'm still carrying this in spite of all that goodness because it lives somewhere in my body and that's what was done to me. And so when we're talking about child abuse and forgiving abusers and, you know, well, what did they go through, this, that, and the other, I gotta tell you, I don't give a fuck. It's not our fault that we're left picking up the pieces and have our lives altered forever. It's theirs. And so I guess I just want people to know that healing is not linear. I might be a little all over the map here, even in the way I'm expressing this. And it is a lifelong journey, and it doesn't have to be one that destroys your life in the process. And while I'm going through some grief and anger and sadness and all of that right now, I'm doing so with the recognition that I'm safe and that I'm loved and that I'm valuable and that I have a right to live life in the way that I choose, and I have a really good relationship with myself so that I'm able to have healthy relationships with others because I don't accept the normalization of the abusive things that I once knew as being normal because I understand the difference now. And I no longer look at when is this pain and anger going to pass, when's it going to be done, and all of that, which is how I went through a lot of my 20s. But rather I look at, okay, this has lived somewhere inside of my body for 58 years, and I'm going to release it now, which means that things that ordinarily would trigger me to, you know, want to do the things I've wanted to do recently will have less power over me, which gives me more control over my life. For anyone else who's gone through this, who's going through the processing of this now, who's gone through abuse, I just want to tell you that you didn't deserve it. It's not your fault. And what they did to you doesn't define you. What you do with it does.